For more on this rather sobering report, so we're now joined by Richard Samans, who's the Director of Research at the International Labour Organization. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
These are very sobering statistics. Before we get into what they mean, tell us how you go about collecting all this information. The globe is an enormous place, and I just wonder how you're able to put all this information together.
Well, it is quite a challenge, and a challenge that has been increased by the pandemic, because just like many parts of our economies, enterprises have had trouble maintaining the continuity of their operations. So in many cases have government statistical agencies on whom we generally rely for these data. And so we have had to innovate during the course of the last year and a half in combining the official numbers that we are able to get from governments like in your country with some other types of data which give us an approximation. Some private sector real-time data that give us a bit of an approximation of what's going on, and use these to give people a better picture than just what is given by the unemployment rate, which only captures people who are actively looking for work. In fact, the pandemic has led many people to leave the workforce and become what we call inactive. And so you really need to get for a full picture of what's going on, you need to be able to cover both of those dimensions. So we had to be fairly creative and industrious in gathering data.
In May 2021, you had forecast 26 million job losses. This number has doubled now. What's happened in between to get us to this really dire situation?
Well, we, of course, when we issued our report back in May of 2021, we were simply estimating without great certainty what was going to happen with this pandemic. And of course, the Delta variant hit our countries in a wave of infections and disruptions in the economy, and then Omicron. And so there are a variety of factors here, but principally those that have had quite an impact on our economies and on people's health and livelihoods, such that fewer people have been able to work as many hours as we had predicted. And then second of all, the labor force participation rate was lower than we recovered less quickly, I should say, than we anticipated.
The vaccine was supposed to change the game somewhat, particularly in those countries where the vaccines came early and the take-up had been quite significant. Has that not really changed the outlook, or could things have been worse?
Well, things could always be worse, but the unevenness of the vaccine rollout, which I think your last segment was addressing, has certainly been a factor in the unevenness of the recovery of job markets around the world. A disproportionate number of the jobs and working hours that have been added in 2021 came in high-income countries, despite the fact that they represent a minor share, maybe 20% of the world population. The limited nature of fiscal support in many developing countries that is available, with the slow and uneven nature of the vaccine rollout and availability, has really impacted lower middle income and low income countries, many countries in Africa, in fact.
So when do you think we might start to see some kind of shift towards rising employment over time?
Well, in fact, we are seeing a snapback, a rise from its depths of working hours and jobs and employment. The problem is that our populations are growing at the same time. And therefore the recovery is not keeping pace sufficiently with the expansion of our populations and working age populations in particular, sufficient to significantly narrow the losses that have occurred since 2019. So, in a word, while we had been much more sanguine about 2022, as you just reported in your intro to this segment, we have had to downgrade our estimates. And indeed, we are showing twice the amount of a job gap in 2022 that we anticipated when we made our earlier estimate in the spring of last year, such that we believe that it will take well into 2023 and perhaps beyond for some countries, particularly those where the vaccination rate is lagging, for their job markets to recover.
COVID-19 has been a disruptor of note. And I know that before the pandemic, we were talking about the future of work, changing nature of jobs. And COVID-19 came and accelerated a lot of that, 4IR, all of that. And I just wonder what effect that's had, because it hasn't given a lot of time to retrain people for a new environment.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, many of our training institutions have been heavily impacted by this pandemic as well, just complicating matters. So on one hand, we've had an acceleration of the uptake of digital and remote means of work. And on the other hand, we've had severe disruption in the education and training activities in our respective economies. And young people have been particularly disadvantaged by that phenomenon.
Does this mean that there are some jobs that are never coming back, that people have become unemployed because some companies have shut down, the economy has destroyed certain sectors, and some jobs are just never going to come back, even if the economy does recover?
Yes, I suspect that is the case. One of the most severely affected industries has, for example, been tourism. And South Africa has been no exception. Your economy has been quite significantly affected by the decline in cross-border tourism. And that is going to take some time, it seems, to come back. And business travel is another aspect of the travel and tourism, where much of the discussion these days about speculating as to what will happen beyond the pandemic seems to suggest that there will not be a full recovery of business-related travel. And that has important effects for many countries that host major conferences or count on a significant amount of business travel in their major urban areas and the like. And then there are other sectors, indeed, where we may see a long-term shift in investment and employment beyond what we saw before the crisis. Only time will tell about this. Maybe the last point I would refer to here is on global supply chains. It does appear to be the case that the repatriation of some supply chains in manufacturing industries is likely to be not a transient matter. It's likely to be longer term. The pandemic may have catalyzed or stimulated this, but there are other factors that suggest that this will be a longer term phenomenon, including the changing politics of international trade and investment, the tensions between the US and China in particular.
Director General Guy Ryder speaks about the future needing to be based on sustainable jobs and decent work. And I just wonder if the pandemic hasn't created more disruption in terms of the nature of the jobs people have and being exploited in job markets, because people are now more desperate, I'm guessing.
Yes, indeed, informal employment has increased relative to formal employment in many countries. In other words, people may have lost their formal salaried arrangement with their firm, and in order to make ends meet, they've moved to less secure, less full-time formal arrangements into own account types of working for themselves or working on a more temporary basis, or just making do with what they can on the street in related work opportunities. So it may take some time for the full-time, more formal and salaried and protected arrangements to come back. And that's a big challenge for people's livelihoods. Incomes have declined. Working poverty has increased quite substantially. After 15 plus years of falling around the world, extreme poverty has risen in the last year and a half. And we've seen that certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. So as you suggest, the precariousness of employment has certainly seen a rise and is something that is a concern for all policymakers and should be a concern for everyone.
All right, you've been at this research game for some time now, and I guess you've seen trends over time. And in steps COVID-19, stage right. What would you say has been the change in trajectory and some of the trends that you're now starting to forecast that were not there before?
I think we're trying to make sense of the shift to remote work. We're trying to make sense of the reshoring of many supply chains. We're trying to make sense in a related fashion of what this means for the development model in developing countries. Will the traditional development ladder of labor-intensive manufacturing employment still provide great opportunity for growth and development in developing countries? Or will this digitization, automation, and reshoring knock a leg out from underneath that ladder and require new approaches in this regard? It's too early for us to be able to say with any confidence what these trends portend, but they are real trends, and they do look like they are likely to have a longer-term presence than just during the health crisis itself.
So what sort of recommendations are you making to policymakers around the world with this information that you've been able to put together?
We have been arguing, and there really is a consensus among member governments and the social partners who engage in this tripartite institution of the International Labour Organization, that fundamentally what is required is an acceleration of investment in people, in their productive employment opportunity, in their capabilities and transitions, and in worker and social protections. And even if that was a very important strategy to prioritize to deal with automation and climate change and longer term trends in the workforce, it's even more urgent and important to undertake to help achieve what we call a human-centered, fully inclusive recovery from the pandemic. So the international community and national governments need to find a way to prioritize increased investment in people in these dimensions because inequality has been expanding and threatens to be entrenched as a result of this crisis, having very disparate effects particularly disproportionate effects on youth, on women, on small businesses, and on people in the informal economy. And that requires an active response along the lines of these types of investment in people. And so we're particularly trying to rally the international community and multilateral institutions in particular to increase support for countries' strategies in these domains.
All right, increased support for countries, and I suppose also increases in social support, that governments must start to invest a little bit more, maybe for a little bit longer.
Yes. Each of these areas really is about social investment, what is typically called social investment. But let's take social protection, for example. The world has reached a consensus for some time now that the social protection should be universal and that there should be a social protection floor in every country covering some basic areas of protection. And that is not the case in much of the developing world right now. And the pandemic has revealed how those gaps are exacerbating the suffering of people in many countries around the world. And so one of the most important areas of social investment is, in fact, to help countries expand their domestic resource availability, coupled with targeted catalytic international financial support to be able to backfill, to provide that level of health security, income security, and transitional assistance for people who lose their jobs or who retire to countries around the world. This has been a long-running problem. It is even more so a crisis now because of this health emergency.
Mr. Richard Samans, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and making sense of these statistics that you've been able to put together. And it's not a great picture, but I guess there's a lot of work to be done to improve things for people across the world. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.